Let's get it on then, shall we? Mwah. Welcome to Sex on the Peach, your weekly hump day dose of everyone's favourite untalked about topic, sex. Let's get honest, let's get open, let's get comfortable, and let's get into this week's show. Friends, lovers, listeners, happy Wednesday, happy hump day, and happy Sex on the Peach day. We are almost now 2 years into recording Sex on the Peach and at the penultimate episode of season 3. So I just want to take a minute to say, for anyone who has listened, shared, liked, talked about, told a friend about, basically engaged at all, I am genuinely so very grateful, because I'm always up against it with social media, and it is so important to me to keep getting information and education out there about sex and relationships. All those things we were never taught, in the hopes of making things better and making sure that everyone knows that whatever they are going through, they are not alone. And one thing I'm specifically grateful for is every single person who has been willing to be open and vulnerable with me, whether that's my guests, people who send me personal emails and messages on my social media about their own experiences. And even though they are anonymous, everyone who sends me in questions, feelings, thoughts, opinions, experiences through to my link every single episode. It means a lot that you trust me with that information, whether that's just me knowing that about you or trying to give guidance on it. My goal is always to open up the conversation about sex so that it can be a healthier, better place for all of us. And every single time someone feels comfortable to share something with me, I hope that goal is heading in the right direction. And so I feel it's only fair for me to take a moment in this season to be open and vulnerable and to talk about the event in my life that significantly affected my sex life for a long time in a negative way. I feel many people, especially women and vulva owners, may be able to silently relate, because this is a topic that many of us feel silenced over. And with that being said, I would like to remind everyone that this is a pro-choice podcast where we support everyone's right to consensually and respectfully do what they want with their time and their bodies. And if you aren't someone who supports that, then this won't be the episode or the podcast for you. This episode comes with trigger warnings of abortion and medical procedures, so please keep that in mind if you choose to listen today, and be kind to yourself if these are topics that may be personal to you. So let's get into it. Here is My Termination Tale. Okay, I want to say that I completely appreciate that everyone's fertility and parenting journey is different, and my choices and my experiences are no reflection on anyone else's. I really empathize that stories of abortion and termination can be incredibly upsetting for people who are perhaps unable or struggling to have children themselves. I truly, really do understand that. And I would agree that it is one of those painfully unfair nuances of life that those who want children don't have the easier fertility journeys than those who maybe don't. And if this story of my experience is upsetting to you for any of these reasons, you might not want to proceed with this episode. And if you do decide to listen, I truly hope you can do so with an open mind, because although my experience may not be what you would personally choose, it is valid. And I hope this is a space where we will all continue to respect and support each other. But if you feel you cannot do that for whatever reason, then I genuinely send love, but please just skip this episode. For anyone who does want to listen, I should probably start by saying that I am unsure if I ever want to have children, especially biologically. I lean more towards the idea that if I decide I ever do want to have them, that I will likely adopt children who are a little older. I've never had that baby thing that people seem to have. And this isn't an opportunity for people to tell me it would be different if I had my own, or maybe I just haven't met the right person. I'm also not straight, so it's not like I'm even on the lookout for a man to be in a relationship with to father my offspring. That is not my goal in life. And that is my personal choice. It isn't for anyone else to comment on. I don't care if you think I should have children. I don't care if you think I would be a good or bad or bang average mother. I don't care if you think we should be on this earth to procreate. Because if you think that, then you can try to procreate and I will wish you well, because I respect all of your choices to do what you all want with your lives and your reproductive systems. Because it goes without saying that people seem to think when it comes to women and theirs, that they can say and offer any judgment or opinion they feel like. As I've always said, I reserve the right to change my mind at any time. But what I do know is I don't want children now. And that's all I can confirm, because we never know what's going to happen. As of now, I am a happy mother to 2 dogs, and that is more than enough. And I also didn't want to have children 5.5 years ago when I unfortunately fell pregnant, and neither did my partner at the time. For transparency, it's worth noting that at the time I was using natural cycles as my main source of birth control. I had been on the pill for a long time, and also the implant, which I've been back on since this event. But I had decided to take a break from hormonal birth control, and to natural cycles' credit, it had been working exceptionally well for over 2 years. And for anyone who maybe doesn't know what Natural Cycles is, it's a digital fertility tracking app that uses basal body temperature and additional cycle data to help users understand their menstrual cycles and manage their fertility. So it's a hormone-free contraceptive method, and it predicts fertile days, which are red days, and non-fertile days, which are green days, based on the personal data that you enter into the app. And it is completely FDA cleared as a contraceptive device. And at the moment, it has a 93% effectiveness rate with typical use. So on green days, the app will indicate a lower likelihood of fertility, which makes it safer for unprotected sex. And red days show a higher fertility window, and that suggests the use of additional contraception or abstinence altogether if you are avoiding pregnancy. And we followed it rigorously with the green and the red days. And on the red days, we always used extra protection. So I should clarify, it wasn't natural cycles error that this event occurred. And had this not happened, I would have gone on using them. It's just because I was too freaked out after all of this happened to continue using something natural. So for anyone who is thinking of using natural cycles as a form of birth control, please don't be put off by this story. Obviously, everyone's fertility and experience will be completely different, but this occurred outside their control because it was indeed a red day. When my partner and I had sex that day, the condom had broken and therefore he ejaculated inside me, which when we realised, we made the decision to take the precaution that I would take the morning after pill, which I did the next day. So there was not one, not two, but 3 forms of birth control in place for all those out there who love to call any woman who gets pregnant irresponsible or any other judgmental shit like that, which I do not have time for. But seemingly no amount of assistance can fight what seemed to be a sperm and egg that were determined to stick together. Honestly, a level of commitment that most people can't even relate to. This is also not an invitation to ask me, did I not think it was meant to be? No, I didn't. It's science and it happens. And neither of us wanted children at that time, which is actually the only important thing here. So I had taken the morning after pill and I went on with my life, presuming that the copious amounts of protection we had used would suffice. At the time, I was performing in a well-known show in London, and this is going to sound really random, but when you are performing in restrictive costumes, corsets, big skirts, you have to really learn what works for you on a matinee day in terms of what you can eat between shows so that you feel fueled for the evening show, but you don't feel like you're going to vomit in your costume. At that time, like the creature of habit I can sometimes be, between every 2 shows, I would always go to Leon and get a meal they had at that time called meatless meatballs. But this one day, just the thought of eating that made me want to immediately throw up in a really visceral way. Like for months, I had eaten this twice a week, but on this one day, thinking about it made me physically balk, which was super weird. But because I didn't anticipate for a single second that maybe it was a food aversion, because maybe I was pregnant, I didn't think too much about it. But that became more and more common over the next couple of weeks. That things I was used to eating, even daily, became completely repulsive to me. My costume started to feel progressively tighter. I started to feel sick all the time. My boobs were really painful, and I was honestly exhausted, like legitimately falling asleep on stage, which is so unbelievably unlike me. But as someone who, if I'm being honest, quite frequently lives on the edge of burnout, I just put it down to being run down, maybe on the verge of getting sick. It was not long into a new year. Illness was flying around the theatre, as it always does after the Christmas and New Year adrenaline has worn off. And I have to say, considering I was such early days, I truly believe every woman and womb owner who goes through pregnancy is a superhero, because I couldn't believe the effect it was having on my body and how terrible I felt. I've always had the greatest of respect for anyone birthing children, but that only elevated it when I got a small window into how it actually feels to be pregnant. Anyway, because I was using natural cycles, it was very specific on my menstruation days, and it was never really wrong. So as soon as I didn't get my period on the days specified for it, I knew. And I really didn't want it to be true. Like, really did not. And neither did my partner, because we were very much on the same page when it came to this. But despite the multiple forms of birth control, apparently it had been the most fertile day of my life. I had indeed fallen pregnant. And it's probably worth me saying, it isn't supposed to be medically easy for me to get pregnant. I have had multiple complications with cancer scares in my reproductive areas. Like, multiple bits have been quite literally cut out, which are their own harrowing tales. But pregnancy should supposedly have been a complicated task for me. Again, no, this does not mean I see it as fate that it was supposed to happen. But I have to be honest, there wasn't really a discussion between myself and my partner over it, because we didn't feel there was a consideration to be had. And I don't want that to sound cold, but that was how far we were from wanting children to be a part of our journey and our relationship together, especially at that point. So our only real point of discussion was arranging when I would have a termination, which was simple enough to arrange. And about 2 weeks later, I went in on a Friday, having told work I had to have a surgical procedure for my appointment. Now, I don't know who listening has ever had a termination or been to an appointment with someone who has had a termination. But once you are there, they don't make it easy. Or they didn't in 2019 when I had mine anyway. I live in the UK, and so this was a procedure done on the NHS, who I, of course, have so much time and support for. But the way it was conducted was not really okay, in my opinion. I had to go through what felt like multiple interviews. And bear in mind, my partner at the time came with me, and he was not subjected to them, just me. That is hugely problematic, in my opinion, because although one partner may physically carry a child, the responsibility for such, if both partners are, of course, present, falls on both. And it's also very isolating to just make one partner go through that. So I think this is something that needs aggressively looking at and changing. And listen, there is a huge, huge part of me that understands that it makes sense to check that this is something someone wants to do. I get that. I'm sure there are many people out there who have had terminations and have maybe regretted them or wished things could have been different. And maybe a certain type of conversation may just allow people the space to rethink or clarify things in their mind to know they are making the right decision for them at that time. But these interviews, because that's what they seemed to be, felt like much more of a guilt trip, if I'm completely honest. It didn't feel very freedom of choice. Like, let's look at all of your available options and whatever you choose, we support you. It felt like multiple people were telling me I was wrong, which again is extremely problematic. First of all, because you don't have the right to judge someone and therefore influence what is a lifetime decision in that way. Secondly, you don't know the ins and outs of someone's personal experiences. And honestly, you aren't setting up a safe space in which someone is going to tell you them. And lastly, how dare you take advantage of people when they are already in such a vulnerable headspace in this way? Like, I really, really disapprove of how this is conducted. And I know it is a huge privilege that we even have access to abortion care in this country. And I really have to say that. The situation in countries that don't, the overturn of Roe versus Wade in 2022, it genuinely fills me with so much horror. And I am truly distraught for the womb owners in these countries who don't have access to safe abortion care. So please don't think that I don't acknowledge my privilege to have even been able to access this. But as a country that does offer this, I still think we can do better, and we can't rest on the laurels of, well, some countries don't get this option at all, as a way to give insufficient and inconsiderate care to people who are already so vulnerable. I can only speak on my personal experience, and of course it will be more relevant to other women and womb owners living in the UK than it will to those living in other countries across the board, because medical is so different in every place. But for anyone who hasn't gone through an abortion, but maybe has to at some point in their lives in the UK, I would say steel yourself for a guilt trip. Steel yourself for basically being made to feel like a piece of shit. And I cannot emphasize enough that I had 0% doubt about my decision. There wasn't a single part of me that could be swayed or influenced. Me and my partner were absolutely confident in our decision, but it made me incredibly concerned about those who maybe weren't so confident and what effect these interviews could have on them. So please do keep that in mind should you ever have to go through this. After it was seemingly agreed that I would be going through with it, and after an examination that decided I was around 8 weeks pregnant, I was told I would be having a medical abortion. So for anyone who doesn't know, as defined by the NHS website itself, a medical abortion involves taking 2 different medicines to end the pregnancy, as opposed to a surgical abortion, which involves an operation to remove the pregnancy from the womb. I believe that a medical abortion is more frequently used when it's earlier on in the pregnancy, and don't fully quote me on that because I'm sure it's case dependent, as with everything, but I understand that's generally how it works. And potentially if you are further along, you might be more inclined and advised to have a surgical abortion instead. I also believe that the procedure has changed a little bit because a friend of mine recently went through a similar situation and they were given medication to take at home, and that wasn't the case for me. I was very much advised to take it in the office of the nurse I was with when they gave me the medication, and I had to take both oral and vaginal medication. Obviously, I went into a separate bathroom to insert the vaginal medication, and I also had to take oral tablets. I have to be honest, it was obviously 5.5 years ago, so I can't remember the order in which I did take that medication, but as far as I remember, they were fairly close together. And after about half an hour, they advised that I was okay to go home. And given what occurred afterwards, I have to say I'm so surprised that they are allowing people to just do them at home and not specifically advising them to have someone or have people there to look after them, because I had no abortion education and I don't know what I thought it was going to be like. And I know that everyone's experience, again, as always, is going to be different and independent to them. But for me, it was the most painful thing I have ever been through in my life. And anyone who knows me closely will vouch for the fact that I have a worryingly high pain threshold, which I know some people brag about, but I actually learned probably about a year ago now that can be quite a significant trauma response to have a high pain threshold, because your body no longer really knows the bar of what pain is to be able to tolerate those higher levels of pain than we naturally should be able to. But anyway, my partner knew me as having that high pain threshold, and he did not know what to do because he had never seen me in a state like this, or even really in a state of pain. I'm definitely one of those people who, even if I am sick or I am in pain, I'm likely to say, I'm fine, don't worry. And I quite often joke if I'm in pain or injured or unwell that I just ignore it until it goes away, which isn't funny or smart, but it is something that I have done my entire life. And that's something I need to work on, I know. But if that's all you know about someone, to see them writhing and blacking out and screaming in pain, I can only imagine is incredibly jarring and scary. But again, for anyone who hasn't been through a termination but might end up doing so at some point in their lives, I think it's pertinent for people to know how painful it might be for them, because at no point in all of those meetings and all of those interviews that I had with multiple doctors and nurses before my procedure did anyone warn me that it could be painful, except they gave me a couple of painkillers and said, you might want to take these. But at no point did they say, FYI, this might be the worst pain you've ever experienced in your life. And I have since looked this up online to see what kind of information is out there. And most websites just say, you may experience some pain or cramping, and we suggest ibuprofen and a hot water bottle, basically likening it to period pains. For me, it was nothing like a period pain. They need to be more honest about the level of pain that you might go through during a termination. And I cannot believe we are not given honest and easily accessible education about it, because when I was going through the pain that I thought, well, of course it's painful. Why did I not think about it? Does my body think I'm going into labor? And am I experiencing a fraction of what a woman actually experiences when she gives birth? But to say you may experience some cramping, that is a complete underestimation in my personal experience. I have never, at this point in my life, experienced a pain like it. And I have gone through multiple very painful medical procedures in my life, and nothing yet has come close to that. And I just cannot believe there wasn't any information out there to tell me that might even be a possibility. And my partner did not know how to handle that, because they had never seen me really in any visible level of pain, let alone drifting in and out of consciousness and screaming because of it. And I messaged one of my best friends because I knew she had gone through something similar, but she lives in the USA, so I wasn't physically with her when it happened. And whilst she had said to me at the time that hers was very painful, when I explained to her what I was going through and I said, is this normal to be literally screaming and blacking out from the pain? And she said, yeah, this is exactly what I experienced. And as I already mentioned, a friend of mine went through a termination fairly recently, and she also experienced this exact same thing. So at this point, the two women I very personally know who have been through a termination, and myself, we are 3 for 3 in terms of this level of pain. So why are we not being told this? Why are we not even being advised that maybe this is something we might come up against? All of the meetings that we have to have before we even go through this procedure, and you really can't mention that just once. Because it should be known that my experience of the termination itself was so incredibly painful, to the point where I got into a very dark place in my mind. And it felt like my body was punishing me for the decision I had made. And take it from me when I say I was so confident in the decision that I made, and it still got in my head in that way. And it was really difficult between my partner and I because he quite simply didn't know how to handle seeing me like that. So his walls went up, and it was almost like he emotionally ran away in that moment. And so that immediately put distance between us, which, when you are already going through something so vulnerable, can feel so isolating. So immediately that was the start of the real disconnect and the fracture that happened in our relationship and our sex life. And I'll go into this a bit more as we get further into the story. But whilst I was angry for a long time, I can reflect and understand that there really isn't anything out there to help or educate partners on how to support their partners who are going through an abortion. I think because it's still considered in society's eyes this big bad decision, it's almost like they don't want to educate people on how to handle it in a way that feels kind and respectful and sensitive, and make it in any way a positive thing for a relationship, just to make it through that peacefully. So the anger and that resentment I held on to for a long time, once again, as with so many other things I talk about on this podcast, it does still circle back to our lack of education and the lack of open conversation surrounding these topics, which we still see as so taboo. Anyway, as with everything else in life, that physical pain was, of course, temporary. And by the end of the night, I had completely passed out. And the next morning, I woke up feeling what I can only describe as groggy, but I felt physically okay. I had been advised by the medical staff that after the abortion, I would experience a little pain. I would experience some bleeding, and so all of the regular precautions could be taken. And these are the kind of precautions I've had to take on and off throughout my life. Whenever I've gone through any other invasive medical procedures in the reproductive areas, stay clear of tampons for a little bit, try not to have baths, and don't have penetrative sex for a little while, because these are all things that can cause infection. And I don't think the medical abortion is as strong as some of the other procedures I've had in the past have been, but I guess it's my nature to follow those rules and go with it. And I also wasn't supposed to be engaging in any heavy physical activity. And at that time, I was not scheduled to be performing in the show that I was doing on that Saturday, the day after my termination, which was a double show day. But I was called into the theatre, and I do appreciate that at the end of the day, it was my decision to go in and do these shows, and I would make a different decision now, knowing what I know. Hindsight is a beautiful thing. But at the time, a lot of pressure was put on me to go in and perform that day, because there was a lack of other performers who could perform my role. So it wasn't as simple as saying, I had a medical procedure yesterday. I'm not really in a position to come in and perform heavily active shows, and that be considered okay. The pressure was really piled on for me to go and do these shows. And in the end, I agreed. And that decision almost killed me. As I already mentioned, I had been told that there might be some bleeding for up to 2 weeks. But 3 weeks passed, 4 weeks passed, 5 weeks passed, and the only thing that hadn't passed was the bleeding. and it was actually getting significantly worse. And I had gone on performing the show as per usual because I had gotten through that Saturday, the day after, and I thought if I can get through that, I can continue getting through them. So I was continuing to go to work and continuing to perform. So let this also be a cautionary tale to any performers out there listening. If you are too unwell physically to do a show, please do stand your ground, because I have never actually been good at that. And I don't want anyone to find themselves in the position that I then found myself. About 5 or 6 weeks later, one day I was doing the show. Luckily, it was at the very end of the show. And in that show, I wore a very, very big dress, and I was sat down. And as I stood up, I literally felt like I had wet myself. There was something running all down my legs, and that's all I knew I could feel. And I was so close to the end of the show that I just got through it. And then at the end, I said to my dresser, is there any chance I could keep this dress on until we get up to the dressing room? Because usually we would take the costume off at the side of the stage because it was so big. And then I would go up in my dressing gown in the lift. But I had no idea what had occurred under my dress. So we got up to the dressing room and I took the dress off, and all down my legs, running into my shoes, was blood, which obviously is not something any of us want to see. And that was also really a vulnerable position for me to be in with my dresser, and for her to be in as well. And luckily she was very supportive. And I should also probably mention, I only told one other person at that time in the show that I was in, that I was having that procedure done, because I didn't want to tell many people, but I thought I just need one person in the building to know in case I do experience anything out of the ordinary, and they will know why that might be happening, whether it was emotional or physical. But obviously now my dresser knew as well. So I cleaned myself up, threw out my show tights, threw out my show pants, and ridiculously brushed it off in my head as just something that maybe happens after someone has gone through a termination. But over the next week, it started happening more and more regularly. One time I was literally standing in the queue at B&Q to buy paint or something for the house. I can't even remember now. And all of a sudden I felt blood literally running down my leg. Saw it running out of the bottom of my trousers and into my shoe. And this is also on me for continuing to ignore it and thinking it was something that would just pass. Because there was one night at the show, I was in the building and I wasn't performing, and it didn't stop. And at that point I thought, I know, I'll take some extra precautions. I'll put in a tampon, I'll use a really thick pad, and I had completely bled through them within about 3 to 5 minutes. So I left and made my way home. And for some reason I thought, I'll have a bath and maybe that will make things better, because why wouldn't we think that? Sure. But it didn't stop. And what didn't help with the fact that I think I'm so inclined to say everything is fine is I'd also conditioned my partner to do the same on my behalf. And so he was also trying to adopt the attitude of, I'm sure everything is going to be fine. When actually we both needed someone there to be like, you need to call an ambulance right now because you are literally bleeding out. And after the bath did not magically fix anything, because of course, why would it? I went and sat in the bathroom and the bleeding was relentless and constant. It did not let up. And I was also starting to look extremely pale, which anyone who knows me knows that is not a common thing for me, and feel extremely lightheaded and extremely unwell. So it got to the point where we called 111, and the person that we spoke to asked if I thought I had lost a pint of blood. And I said, I think I've easily lost about 3 or 4. They immediately said they were going to send an ambulance, which I thought was far too fussy, and offered to drive myself to the hospital because my partner didn't drive, but I did say they would be with me, which I was told was completely ridiculous. And they did send an ambulance, and wildly, I was embarrassed because I had a hair mask in, so my hair was wrapped up in a hair towel, as if that was something I needed to be worried about at that time. But I guess our brain just comes up with stupid things to keep us occupied. I was rushed into hospital and had to have an emergency blood transfusion. And after further examination, they found that I had a blood clot the size of a melon in my womb. And this had occurred because I had gone back to physical activity far too quickly after the procedure. And basically my body had gone into shock and clotted to try and protect itself. So my decision to go back to work the day after my termination had basically caused this. And I had to have that clot vacuumed out of me, literally Henry Hoovered out of my womb. As you can imagine, not a pleasant thing to go through as a woman. Obviously, I was under anesthesia. I was not awake for the procedure, but to know that you are having your reproductive organs vacuumed, it wasn't my favorite moment in my life. And those dark thoughts of my body is coming back to punish me for this decision that I have made started slowly creeping back in. And once again, my partner just didn't know how to be there for me because they were so used to seeing me be there for myself. And I will hold my hands up and say I am an extremely self-sufficient and independent person. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I find it hard to let people in, but I think I give off the impression that I don't need anyone else to be in. So people don't think they are the ways in which they need to assist me, because the thought process is always very much like Maria or Peach or whatever anyone wants to refer to me as will get herself through this, because I always have. But again, I was really hurt and really angry for a long time because I just thought he didn't care, because that's how it looked to me. But he was just scared and had no fucking idea how to deal with it. And after 2 days in hospital, I was allowed to go home. And the hospital contacted my place of work at the time and said they were not to call me in for a few weeks to make sure that I recovered fully before returning, which anyone who knows me knows that was hell. Because for me to not be at work for multiple weeks, it's just not how I operate at all. But given the poor decision making regarding work in the first place, I did recognize that this was an attitude of mine that I really needed to change for the sake of my physical health. But it also meant my partner and I had a lot of time at home to not deal with this very well. And once again, because of the procedure, I was not allowed to have sex. And that felt like a huge relief, because those dark thoughts had then become, anytime I have sex, this will happen again. And as someone who is incredibly sexually active and has been for a long, long time, and someone who enjoys to have frequent sex in my relationships, that is a drastic shift in mindset. And even the thought of my partner touching me and the thought that it could lead eventually to us having sex felt like a nightmare. And it was like one of my favorite things in life was now my worst fear. And that wasn't just because of the thought of getting pregnant and going through this again. It was also because I felt fucking disgusting at that point. I couldn't remember a time when I wasn't bleeding, and knowing you've had a fucking vacuum up your vagina, it's just a really unpleasant thing to deal with. And one of the unfortunate things about being a woman and a vulva owner is that so many procedures are so invasive, and you feel like such a vulnerable part of your body is quite literally being invaded all the fucking time. But the last thing you think it's going to be invaded by is a Dyson. And I am someone who is a very clean and hygienic person, as I would always recommend anyone to be. I take great care with my hygiene and my genital hygiene, but all of these things were out of my control. I couldn't do anything about them. I couldn't physically stop myself bleeding. I couldn't take care of that blood clot myself. These were all things that were happening to my body that were so far out of my control. And that is so incredibly unnerving, because I would definitely say that I can be a control freak. And there was just nothing I could do about it. And sadly, my partner and I never managed to come back from it. I don't think either of us knew how to communicate how we were really feeling in the right way, because there was so much heightened emotion. But on my part, I was so angry for what felt like the lack of care and consideration, because his reaction was to put his walls up and almost remain low key. And I think that was him trying to evade any pain he might be feeling, because he was probably trying to prioritize mine, but it just didn't feel that way, or I couldn't see it that way at the time. And as I've already said, he just didn't know how to provide for me in a way that responded to me being needy, because he hadn't seen that before. And when you are already almost 3 years into a relationship with someone, that can feel like a very dramatic shift, which these are all things I've only learned from reflecting on that time, because all I could see at the time was anger and hurt and resentment towards him. And I also blamed him for it happening, which is ridiculous. Sex is, well, it was for us always a very mutual thing, as it should be. And of course, it wasn't his fault. But I obviously wasn't in the sanest mindset of my life at that time. And it almost felt like it was his fault that I had gone through everything, and his fault that I no longer wanted to have sex anymore. So even when a significant amount of time had passed and I still didn't want to have sex, I kind of rationalized it with, well, this is kind of on you, which is so incredibly unfair and not something I even realized I was doing until I did the work after that relationship and realized how we were not just not on the same page, we weren't even in the same book, we weren't even in the same library. We were operating on such different fields of fear and shame and guilt and hurt and upset and anger and resentment that we were just never going to find a way to come together and work through it. And I think at the end of the day, we both know we weren't right for each other anyway as long-term partners. There were other underlying issues, but it was one of the things that really highlighted to me how important the right kind of communication is when you do go through a significant challenge with your partner. But in terms of sex, it went from being one of my number one favorite things in the world to do to being repulsive to me. Even just the thought of it filled me with disgust. And I've always been someone that even when I'm in a relationship, I will still always masturbate. I will still always practice solo sex. But I didn't even want to do that, even though that doesn't run the risk of me getting pregnant. You know, there was no risk that a sex toy was going to put a baby in me. But for the first time in my life, there just wasn't a sexual bone in my body. And even the few times that we did then have sex before our relationship ran its course, there was a huge, huge disconnect. And that sex was fully consensual. I wanted to try because obviously there was always a part of my mind that wanted to push through and get back to myself, but it didn't feel right. And that caused further distance and further disconnect because I just couldn't enjoy it in the same way that I used to, which is difficult on both partners. But again, at the time, I could only really see myself and the ordeal that I had gone through. And it almost felt impossible to think, I've gone through this life-changing event and I'm supposed to purely just consider your sexual desires right now. And I do think it's natural for someone in my position to feel that way. But I don't think that means it's right, because we do all have needs in our relationship, and our level of care and consideration and communication with each other needed to be significantly better. And for the year after that happened, that we were still together, most of it we spent working apart from one another. And that just constantly felt like a relief, because it meant I didn't have to face that side of our relationship, because for a long time I just could not see a way through. I truly believed that my relationship with sex was forever changed. And like I said at the beginning of this episode, natural cycles was not to blame for this happening. But even though I have got my relationship with sex back and then some, I don't think I could ever go on a natural form of birth control again, because it would just fill me with too much anxiety. And although hormonal birth control isn't for everyone, and I wouldn't even recommend it for everyone, and we all have to make the right choices for our own bodies, I will personally probably always be on it, because I feel like that is almost my comfort blanket, that this little tiny plastic tube in my arm that I can physically feel and just know it is protecting me from getting pregnant. I do also frequently use additional birth control, of course, but knowing and seeing and feeling that I have the implant there has made a huge difference to overcoming that specific event in my life. And I know that it can be scary to come out of a long-term relationship and then have sex with someone new, but I've never personally felt like that. I've never worried about that. If anything, I've always been kind of excited about that. However, this time it felt like climbing fucking Mount Everest, because weirdly, now not only was I having to face sex again, but I was also having to face having sex with someone who didn't know the ins and outs, literally, of what my body had been going through. Like, I cannot emphasize how grossed out I had felt by my own body and what had happened, but I knew that he at least understood that side of things, because he was present for the entire thing. And even though I was physically healed and I was back to my normal self in terms of genital health, and even though at this point I was physically healed I was back to full genital health, still the thought of oral sex, which is my favorite thing in the world to do, felt unnerving. It felt scary. The thought of having someone's head down there and thoughts creeping in of what I'd been through with someone who didn't know, because at least with my partner, he was present for the entire thing. So he knew what I had gone through. And if anything were to occur, he would have that level of physical understanding. And I would say, in all honesty, it took me a little over 2 years to really recover my relationship with sex. Even though I was still having it, I wasn't enjoying it in the way that I once did. And I think lockdown maybe helped with that a little bit, because it forced me to take time out of having sex, which is not my natural go-to thing to do, which is maybe its own problem. But I had to reassess everything that my body and mind had gone through after the termination. And I really wanted to tell this story today because I think a lot of people may listen to this podcast and think I have a thriving sex life. And listen, at times I do, but there have been significant challenges that needed overcoming. And I know I've spoken before about having been in abusive relationships and the different ways in which that affected my sex life. But I need people to know that sex is not linear. You don't learn sex and then have a great sex life forever. That's just not how it works. And I don't know who out there has gone through a termination and what your experience has been, or if you have friends, siblings, colleagues who have gone through a termination and what their experiences have been. But I would implore anyone to start to care more about the ways in which abortion can affect women and womb owners, because it isn't talked about enough. It isn't supported enough. It isn't respected at all. I told one person that I worked with at the time. I didn't even tell my own mother, who is my best friend, until I was rushed into hospital the night of my blood transfusion. I told a couple of my best friends, I think. And I'm usually very open about everything. And I knew I was making the right decision for me, but it is the thing that has brought me the most shame in my life. I felt so scared to tell people. I felt so shamed by society and the way in which they place so much blame and so much hatred on women and womb owners who have terminations. And with the greatest of respect, because this doesn't take away from the emotional impact that it might have on men and penis owners out there, they are physically able to continue on as normal without a physical impact on their body. And that's not to say the emotional impact may not be painful and may not be significant, but it really isn't the same. And the societal judgment is absolutely not the same towards a man or a penis owner as it is towards a woman and womb owner. And I truly believe that has to change. There needs to be better education on abortion. There needs to be better support for women and womb owners going through abortion. And there needs to be more open and non-judgmental conversation around the topic altogether. I did eventually end up speaking to a therapist about this after my relationship had ended, because there was a part of me that thought miraculously it might all go away if I'm having sex with someone else. But that wasn't the case. In fact, I would say it was worse, because they didn't have any personal attachment to what I had gone through. And therefore, that felt really fucking scary. And I personally had some CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. And it isn't always my favorite type of therapy, I have to be honest. But it can be really helpful when you are dealing with negative thought processes or negative thought patterns, to put structures into place to shift yourself out of them. And that was incredibly helpful for what I was going through with that dark space I would go to in my head when it came to sex. And it was life-changing. And with the time we were offered through lockdown to have a reset, to get to know my body again, this was all imperative in my journey back to enjoying sex. I did have to come back to myself, and it's one of the reasons I always recommend that on this podcast. Sometimes even if you know your body, you have to relearn it. And that is what I had to do, because I thought maybe some things do feel different now. Maybe there are specific areas that I don't enjoy being touched as much anymore because it triggers something physically or emotionally, or maybe my sensitivities have changed. So I had to learn my body again so that the sexual partners I did go on to having could also have that information. So it took a few years. It took therapy, and it took relearning my own body after that trauma. But I will say I have come out the other side of it, and I'm probably enjoying sex more now than ever. And that isn't just because of those things. It is also because my communication is much more elevated than it used to be. And I have obviously put a lot of work into educating and informing myself about sex, which maybe I wouldn't have done if it wasn't for this and for the other negative sexual encounters I've experienced in my life. But although this was a very hard episode to record, I'd say probably the hardest one, because when I recorded my Sex After Trauma episode in season 2, I know there are so many other people out there who have dealt with abuse in relationships and outside of relationships, even people in my everyday life who I know and can talk to about it. But I don't know very many people who have experienced a termination or this reaction to one. And abortion comes with a level of judgment and hate that speaking openly about abuse doesn't. So for anyone listening, if you have ever experienced anything like this, I see you, I hear you, and I've got you. And please always feel free to reach out to me and let me know or ask any questions. My door is open to you. And I'm also sending you so much love. And I hope that me sharing this story today will help just one person out there, whether it's someone who has personally gone through something like this, or whether you know someone who has. And maybe this might encourage people to look at how they can perhaps better support anyone going through something similar. But I do promise that although it might feel like the end of your sex life, there is so much light at the end of the tunnel. And I really hope this story will inspire you to know that. And thank you for listening. So before I wrap up today's episode, I had put out on my anonymous link this week that if anyone else had any experiences that they would like to share that had affected their sex lives, to please send them in. And I thought I would do that in the hopes of sharing them with anyone who might need to hear them. But I would like to say such a huge thank you to everyone who did send something in, and we will get into those just now. So the first one that I was sent in was this. After getting ill with COVID, I began to lose most of the feeling and sensation in my lower body. Whilst my body still functions, I struggle to enjoy sex as much. I'm curious about how to lean into the psychological and kink aspect of sex, as someone who's not necessarily been that way inclined. I'm so sorry to hear about the challenges that you have faced since COVID. I did have a partner who went through a phase of struggling to get an erection for a while after having COVID, and that was hugely anxiety inducing for him. And apparently the doctor saw an influx of that being a problem. So I don't think you are the only person who has seen a sexual health concern come out the back of COVID, which is really worrying because we just don't have the right information out there about it. But I would say exploring the psychological and kink aspects of sex can be a fantastic way to connect and find pleasure. And this probably isn't the right episode to fully go into it because we're almost out of time. But if you have a partner at this moment, maybe try having an open conversation with them about fantasies, desires, and experiment with some sensory stimulation that doesn't rely solely on touch. Role play and fantasy scenarios can add some excitement and some intimacy, and those sorts of sensory experiences can help enhance your sexual connection if you do feel like you are physically more limited at the moment. But I would say that's really specific, and it might be worth consulting a therapist who specializes in that area to provide some support. But I really hope that that sensation does come back. But I am here for you in whatever way I can be. And I think that leaning into the psychological side of things might be a fantastic way to reconnect with your body. But thank you so much for sending that in. I appreciate it. And I really hope that helps anyone else who might be dealing with something similar post-COVID. I was raped, and it seriously affected my sex life and think it will do for the rest of my life. It happened 9 years ago. I count myself lucky that my abuser was sentenced. But when I met my now fiance 6 years ago, things were incredibly hard when it came to sex. I really am lucky that he was and still is the most patient and caring person, but those early days in figuring things out were rough. I was scared to let someone see me so vulnerable and was worried it was going to scare him away, but he took everything in his stride. I know you say it on most episodes, but conversation was absolutely key. I had to tell him exactly how I felt. That was a mission in itself, but once we got there, it was a learning curve after learning curve. I'd have flashbacks in the middle of sex that would send panic over me and would make me want to push him away and never have sex again. We then wouldn't have sex for weeks, and it was hard. But being able to talk to him so openly made the world of difference. I wasn't going to let my abuser win by taking away something I enjoyed. Bit of a deep story, but there is light at the end of the tunnel through conversation. Thank you so much for sharing that deeply personal story. It's incredibly brave of you to talk about the impact of your trauma and the journey that you've been on with your fiance. And also it's heartening to hear that open communication played such a crucial role in navigating those challenges. And I hope that so many people can take a leaf out of that book, especially as a partner supporting someone who has been through rape and sexual assault. And your resilience and your partner's patience are both really inspiring. So I hope this experience highlights the very profound difference that understanding and open dialogue can make. And I really hope this story offers hope to others who might be facing similar struggles. But thank you so much for your vulnerability in sending that in. I really appreciate it. And I am so, so happy to hear that your fiance and you are thriving. That is amazing. Not had sex in 6 months since I was sexually assaulted. I was pretty confident, but now can't even bear to touch myself. It has ruined sex for me. Again, I'm so sorry. I feel like this is what I am going to be saying to most of these that have been sent in. I'm so sorry to hear about what you've been through, but it is completely understandable that the trauma of sexual assault has deeply affected your relationship with sex and your own body. Obviously, this episode is about something completely different, but I hope you will have heard that I also felt disturbed by my own body. So even though it's a different scenario, I hope that at least makes you feel less alone. And it's really important to give yourself grace and recognize that healing from experiences like this really takes time. If it's accessible to you, I would always recommend anyone who has been through sexual assault to speak with a therapist, potentially one who specializes in trauma, because that can be incredibly helpful in navigating your feelings and slowly rebuilding your confidence. But in the meantime, focus on self-care and finding supportive and non-sexual ways to reconnect with your body. That will also be really beneficial, but just please remind yourself that you deserve compassion and patience as you work through this. There's no timeline. So please take your time, and I really hope that you have a good support system to help you through it, but I'm always here if you need to reach out further. I'm on medication for high blood pressure, and one of the side effects has been a significant decrease in libido. It's been really frustrating because I didn't expect this to affect my sex life so drastically. My partner is supportive, but it's tough to deal with this change. I'm curious if others have experienced similar issues and how they've managed to handle the impact on their relationships. I really appreciate you sharing this because medication side effects can really impact people's sex lives, and it might be worth discussing alternative medications or treatments with your doctor to see if there are options with fewer side effects. I'm so glad that your partner is supportive, but please do keep that communication open about these challenges just so that the two of you can navigate it together. And sometimes finding new ways to connect and prioritize intimacy can help the impact of these changes. And I don't know how much of the podcast that you have listened to, but there is an episode called When Desire Takes a Detour that does discuss decrease in libido. So maybe something in there might be helpful, but I know that a decrease in libido can feel incredibly frustrating and anxiety inducing, especially when it's due to something out of your control. But I am so glad to hear that your partner is supportive, and I hope if the two of you keep communicating and keep that channel of dialogue open and potentially with some alternative treatment, that might be a way through. But please do keep in touch. I'm sending you so much love, and I'm sorry you're going through this. There are so many fucking shitty things we all have to deal with sexually, hey? And I'm seeing that from all of the things you're all sending in because they're all so different and we're just not talking about this stuff enough. Anyway, I mustn't digress. Next up. After having our first child, my partner and I have seen a huge shift in our sex life. Between the new responsibilities and the exhaustion, we found it hard to reconnect sexually. I feel like we've lost a bit of our intimacy, and it's been tough to find the time and energy for each other. Yeah, I mean, the transition to parenthood is going to significantly impact the majority of relationships and sex lives. And it sounds far too easy to just say it's really important to prioritize your relationship amongst all your new responsibilities because people are exhausted. So try, if you can, to just find small ways to connect with your partner to help maintain that intimacy. And if you can, schedule small regular date nights just to put some time into each other. And also, please don't hesitate to reach out for help or advice from others who have gone through similar changes. So many people will be going through a similar shift, and we really all need to be supporting each other. There is an episode, I think it was back in season 1, called Long Time Coming, which talks about scheduling dates and even scheduling sex. I don't know if that might be helpful, but I hope it might be. And I really hope that as time passes and maybe your child is a little older, that you might be able to have some more time and energy for each other. But yeah, I'm sending you both a lot of love and support. I know that the shift into parenthood can be really tough, and that isn't from me, obviously, given this episode, but from everyone I know who is in a relationship with children. I know it can be really, really tough. So I am sending you lots and lots of love and support. I grew up in a conservative family with strict religious beliefs about sex, and it's left me with a lot of guilt and confusion. Now, as an adult, I find it difficult to enjoy sex without feeling a sense of shame or worry. It's affecting my relationship, and I'm struggling to reconcile my upbringing with my current desires and needs. Oh my gosh, religious shame is such a huge thing, and navigating that conflict between cultural or religious belief and sex can be so challenging for people. And that's tough because we just shouldn't have that shame about sex, because there isn't this overseer of our sex lives, even for people who do believe in whatever God or higher presence they do. That wasn't really their intention, was it? To tell us what we could and couldn't do in bed. And are you talking to your partner openly about it? Because I would say you probably need to be having some pretty detailed discussions with them about how this is affecting your intimacy. And I would say let them know your specific concerns related to your beliefs, and maybe even look at how they can be interpreted in a way that allows for the two of you to have a satisfying sexual relationship. You know, even when it comes to sex, it's completely fine to set small, achievable goals. And for you, that might be ways to look at how to integrate these values with your needs, such as trying new forms of intimacy that can align with both. And just keep checking in with each other about what's working and what isn't. And then you can keep making adjustments. But it is a process that requires a lot of understanding, because religious shame is so hard to let go of. And I wish it didn't exist in the first place, because I don't think that religion should hold a monopoly over people's sex lives. But I understand that it is there. And so I completely empathize with you having to work through that. But I think it's really important that you and your partner have ongoing communication about it. And hopefully you can find a balance that respects your values that you might still be holding on to in terms of your religion and meets your needs. But also, if you find a way to turn around and say a big fuck you to that religious shame, I support that too. I've been dealing with erectile dysfunction for a while, and it's really affecting my self-esteem and relationship. I'm seeing a doctor, but it's still a struggle to feel confident in intimate moments. My partner is understanding, but it's hard not to feel like a failure. Yeah, dealing with erectile dysfunction is really challenging for both your self-esteem and a relationship if you are in one. And again, I've mentioned this episode already, but When Desire Takes a Detour does do quite a deep dive into this, so maybe something in there might be helpful. But I will say it's really great that you are seeing a doctor, because addressing the underlying issues is going to help. But in the meantime, I would say focusing on your emotional intimacy and exploring different ways to connect with your partner outside of traditional sex. Also, feel free to listen to the Ode to Outer course, which will tell you many, many other options. But that kind of thing can help maintain your relationship. And obviously, if it continues to be an issue for you, it might come to a point where it will be helpful to speak with a therapist, if that's accessible to you, who specializes in sexual health, and they can help you to address the emotional aspects of this issue and give you guidance on how to work through it with your partner. But this is a very, very, very common issue, and I think there will be many people listening who can empathize with this because they are also going through it. So thank you so much for sending it in. You are not a failure. Nothing physical that our bodies do that is outside of our control makes us a failure. And I really would like to get rid of the word failure altogether, to be honest. It's far too binary in terms of right and wrong. And for you not to be able to get an erection doesn't make you wrong. It doesn't make you a failure. It's just a hurdle that your body is going through. And I hope that you will overcome it in the way that you want to, but there are other ways around it. And I really hope that between your doctor, your partner, hopefully a couple of my episodes, and potentially a therapist, if you feel that might be helpful, I do think you will be able to find ways to, at very least, boost your confidence and not feel like a failure, because you aren't at all, and no one is. And I hope anyone out there listening knows that. But thank you so much to everyone for sending those experiences in today. As I said at the beginning of the episode, it means so, so much every time someone is willing to be open and vulnerable with me. And I'm sorry to hear that so many people are going through so many challenges sexually. And I do think if we were all able to talk more openly about all of them, we'd all feel so much more comfortable and confident within them, and it wouldn't feel so isolating and challenging. I would say that actually this is definitely a space where a problem shared is a problem halved really comes into play. But thank you so, so much to everyone who sent those in to me today. And I really hope that to anyone listening, maybe you heard something that you can relate to, and maybe it's just helpful to know, once again, as always, that you aren't alone in whatever you are going through sexually. But that is all from me today. I will be back next week for the season finale, and the link will be going out soon for you to send in whatever you want, because as we know, I will be joined by my two best friends, Devika Joshi and Katie Faye Morehouse, and it's a free-for-all. And if we've hooked up since the last season finale, you can listen at your peril. No, I'm only joking. It's all anonymous. But you can send in whatever you want, whether that is questions, would you rather, stories, thoughts, feelings, opinions, whatever you feel you would like to air on the season finale. That link will soon be out for you to send those into. But thank you so much for bearing with me today. I really hope that my story and the other stories that have been sent in might be helpful, even just to one person. And if they are, then I have done what I set out to do. But I will see you next week for the season 3 finale. But for now, thanks for coming. Thank you for tuning in to Sex on the Peach today, and I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. You can find and follow me on Instagram, YouTube and TikTok at Sex on the Peach Cast, and you can also get in touch with me at sexonthepeachcast@gmail.com. Please do continue to like, share, subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and I'll see you next week. Love, Peach.